Bonjour, bienvenue au CRDI. Good morning, everyone.
Bonjour, bienvenue au CRDI.
Building here in Ottawa to have the opportunity to discuss about food security with a guest of honor, which is Dr. Carlos Pérez del Castillo. Alors, plusieurs d'entre vous êtes familiers avec...
Several of you know about IDRC and its mandate, which is essentially to support research done in developing countries, research that aims at analyzing the needs of the populations there and to find innovations that are integrated in a policy area and that can serve as best as possible the development of these populations. IDRC
for over 40 years now. At the origins of IDRC, there was a lot of agriculture. IDRC was part of the organization that supported the initial Green Revolution. We did so by supporting the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, where our guest, Carlos Pérez del Castillo, is the chair of the consortium board, the consortium of the 15th Center. And IDRC was there in the early days. As with CETA, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, USAID, and DFID, we contributed to the initial creation of the CGIAR in 1971, some 41 years ago. They celebrated their 40th anniversary last year. We celebrated ours 2 years ago. So we were created around the same time. And IDRC, as I mentioned, was playing a vital role in the support from the Green Revolution. But its support evolved then to the development of farming system. You know, not only looking at the seeds and the new variety, but looking at farms. And our farm are part of system where it's not only about the production, but it's about the environmental management, it's about the social dimension. And it's also about a third area where we provided a lot of support, gender. The role of women in agriculture, and particularly in smallholder farming. More recently, our support to the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research has been to provide support in what they have been called the reform, but what I would call now the new CGIAR. New CGIAR that Carlos will say a few words about, and where our support has been going towards agriculture, human health, nutrition, as well towards aquaculture, as well as orphan crops like root, tuber, and bananas. Now, this new angle of our support to the CGIAR is linked to our mission. Look for things that others are not necessarily looking for a lot, and look for trends that will influence the agenda in the future. If you think of aquatic system, for example, they are booming in many regions of the world. And we still haven't figured out what are all the impact and how does this translate in the life and livelihood of people. So we're providing support there. IDRC provided support on the intellectual side, but has been also quite active in providing also part of its staff that have migrated back and forward with the CGIAR system. Our first president, David Hopper, that passed away recently, late David Hopper, was our first president, but then moved to the World Bank and become the first chair of the CGI, one of the first chair of the CGIAR system. Joe Hulse, that was a vice president over here, also contributed a lot to the early days of the CGIAR. Jeff Otten was a director, was eventually director of center over there. Hubert Zanstra, Joachim Voss, Carlos Seri, and the band goes on. Numbers of our colleagues at IDRC became influential in the system itself as head of centers. But the Canadians have also been present at the level of the governance of these institutions. Names like Maggie Cartley-Carlson, John Coleman, Chandra Madramutu, and Brian Harveys that are coming either from CETA, that are coming from that are former member of public services or members of universities, have served also on the governance body of the system. So Canada and the CGIAR, IDRC and the CGIAR have a long history of relationship. And today, we are hosting Carlos Pérez del Castillo that will talk about, Food security, how the system is responding to it, and what are some of the innovation that have been seen in the recent past and what we can expect for the future or how the future looks like. I first met Carlos in a video conference when he was appointed chair of the CGIAR. I was in Washington, and already he was in Montevideo. We were in Washington, and it was the first contact, and we could see that passion was coming across as something important for Carlos and for particularly vis-a-vis agriculture. We had our first face-to-face meeting in Montpellier. You may recall, we walked together, and Carlos asked me, Jean, what can I do in order to help you, to have IDRC participate better into the CGIAR? And this trend of, going directly to the topic is something that Carlos is doing, with remarkable diplomatic skill with all members of the CGIAR. There are 64 members, countries, multilateral organization, and foundation. In 3 years as the chair of the consortium board, he has already shown that the CGIAR can change. The new CGIAR talk with one voice, his voice, and the one of the consortium. The CGIAR has one strategy, not 15, like it used to be with each of the center. CGIAR has a set of coherent programs that tackle crucial elements of food security and agricultural research for development. And this has led to some tangible output already. The resource available to the CGIAR has been increasing. Not only have they been increasing, but they have been increasing with the notion that there's more money for core support, for giving the researcher the opportunity to work on their science and not to run around to grab money. There's still a long way to go, but I think the trend is positive. More substantially, last week we had a meeting of the donors with the representative of the consortium, and we approved an IP policy, intellectual property policy. That was the first time in 40 years that we were able to tackle this with success. And that was because of the leadership of the consortium and of the donors that came together and said, we have to fix this. We cannot continue to operate without IP policy or with IP policy that are different from one center to the other. So now we have with the CGIAR one system for IP policy that will gradually be implemented. So these are concrete results of how the system is now changing. One voice, a coherent set of program, and leadership, and clear output. But it's only the beginning, and Carlos will entertain us on what some of the other things that have been happening. Carlos was a vice minister and acting minister for foreign affairs for the government of Uruguay. He was also ambassador of Uruguay to Geneva and to the WTO. He has been involved in a number of negotiations. He was also the chairman of the General Council of the WTO, as well as other WTO body over his career. He participated in the review panel that did the external review of FAO in 2007. And he's currently a member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition that is chaired, I think, by David Nabarro, who is led. Swaminathan, yes, by Dr. Swaminathan. My apologies. And now he is the chairman of the CGIAR consortium board. And when he has free time, not traveling around the world, he is also a cattle farmer in Uruguay. And it's a pleasure for me to leave him to speak at the podium, to welcome him at IDRC. C'est un grand plaisir, Carlos, de t'avoir.
It's a great pleasure to have you with us here, Carlos, today.
And with our colleagues that might be listening to us on the web. The program will be your presentation, Carlos. We will then have question and answer, and we should wrap this up around 11:15, no later than that. So please welcome with me Dr. Carlos Pérez del Castillo. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank Jean for his very generous introduction, and also IDRC for having invited me to be here in Canada over the last 2 days, and to be able to have this opportunity to exchange views with all of you, a distinguished audience who I've been aware that you are very much on the subject of international agricultural research for development. So it's a great pleasure, and I would like, therefore, to tell you a little bit of where we are, where we hope we will be going, and how international agricultural research is being focused at the moment to deal with the many challenges that we have ahead of us. I know that your audience is familiar with the CGIAR, so I will only say a few words for those who may not be on what we are and the purpose of our mission. As you know, we are a partnership of 15 international agricultural research centers. They're all specialized in different subjects. Some of them are specialists in crops, like rice, wheat, maize, and a number of others, livestock, legumes, dry land cereals, forestry. And for the last 40 years, they've been working independently, the ones from the others, with their own research mandate and in direct contact with the donors. And these 15 centers operate in 150 sites around the world. And they have at the moment around 2,000 scientists of a total staff of about 8,000, but 2,000 scientists that devote their daily lives to research work. And they are being supported, as Jean was saying, by a number of countries like Canada and others, a number of international organizations, and a number of private foundations that bring their financial support in order to carry out this work. Canada has been supporting, a founding father of the CGIAR since its beginning. And for 14 years, we have enjoyed not only the support of Canada through funding, but also, as Jean was mentioning, through intellectual leadership. There have been a lot of Canadians who have fulfilled high-level posts in the CGIAR, who have given policy orientation to our work. A number of universities in Canada, as much as 8 universities, are working in different projects together with the CGIAR centers. And Canada has been very much in the forefront of the reform that was needed to tackle these issues. When I speak about Canada, I speak about the 2 organizations through which this support is channeled, basically CEDA and the IDRC. And the IDRC has been extremely instrumental in bringing some of the needed changes in the system. At present, the IDRC is orienting its focus to areas of research which are relatively new for the system, which was in the past very much oriented to crop and yield improvements. At the moment, the IDRC is channeling support towards the aquatic agricultural systems and the potential it has with regards to food security. They have been pioneers in bringing together research areas that have their proper community, which is agricultural research, nutrition, and health. And now the 3 communities are coming together in one of our major programs, which is being supported by IDRC. They have also have an important input in new areas having to do with policies, institutions, and gender mainstreaming across the whole research agenda. So we welcome very much Canadian support. It has been extremely important for us, and we certainly hope that they will come with us. They will come accompany us in the journey that is still ahead. So what are the new challenges that agricultural research is facing today? We are obviously very much dedicated, as we did in the past, to provide research that will allow to meet the needs of a growing population. We know that by 2050, there will be 9 billion people in the world. Agricultural production will have to increase by at least 70%, 100% in developing countries. And this is a major task of how to bring about, to fill the gap between supply and demand in a world in which we feel natural resources crisis. You know, land has been mainly fully utilized in a lot of countries, and there is very little new land arable around the world. Water is scarce. Agriculture will have to compete more and more against other uses, urban uses. Groundwater, in many cases, is being depleted, and you have to, in other words, the challenge here is to fill that gap between supply and demand, to increase productivity, but with the notion that resources are going to be scarcer, and you will have to produce more with less water and land. Another major challenge that we face is the climate change. Climate change is certainly going to have an impact on agricultural production, in some cases for better, in some cases for worse. And already we have projections that show that there will be significant declines in agricultural production in many areas of the world, and in particularly in developing countries. So we have to face that challenge and see how, through adaptation and mitigation, we can deal with these problems. We have also seen recently a price volatility crisis affecting agricultural production. This has, on the one hand, a negative impact on agricultural consumers, and on the other, it could also, the volatility is bad in any circumstances, but some of the price hikes that we have seen may also have an impact and give some incentives to in some countries that had the potential for agricultural production, but that were inhibited to show it because of subsidized exports that they were receiving on the same commodities. This situation may improve, and we will have to look into it. We have dietary changes in developing countries, moving away from crops into more milk and meat, and this is certainly something that it's in a challenge that has to be taken into account in research. We have an energy crisis. A lot of the food staples are now being shifted to biofuels in many countries. Many countries have adopted legislation by which more and more crops, ethanol or biofuels, will be produced, and therefore this could have an impact not only on availability of supplies around the world, but also on prices as well, as we have seen from the recent price crisis. And above all, at the moment, we have a financial crisis, and therefore, once you are in a financial crisis, when governments have to judge where the aid money is going to go, they will certainly be looking for impact. They will certainly be looking for value for money, and this is something that research has to keep into account if we want to be able to continue to receive the continued support that we've been getting from the international community. So we have multiple and complex challenges that have to be addressed, and I think that some of the changes that came out in the CGIAR in the last few years, I've been there now for 2 years, and I was asked to join as a board chair in order to lead that reform process. Some of these changes, as I was mentioning, are a direct consequence of meeting the new challenges. We cannot continue with business as usual, as in the past. We cannot continue with 15 centers doing their individual jobs or research without looking into synergies among them, into possible duplications, into overlaps. And the essence of the reform was basically to bring through collective actions, through the expertise that the different centers can provide on commodities or resource management, on gender, on policies, on institutions, on markets, to bring them all together and to change the center of our research from a center-focused research into a programs center research. And the programs are basically around 7 thematic areas. One of the thematic areas, which is new, or relatively new, although it has been tried in the past, but with great difficulties, is the whole notion of, instead of looking at commodities as such, looking at production systems. And so there are 3 programs at the moment that we are envisaging in different parts of the world, working together with communities on the dry lands and the humid tropics and aquatic area systems, in which we will address the problems of the farmers and the communities who live there with an integrated approach of not only crops and livestock and forestries and institutions, but trying to bring gender mainstreaming over all these problems. So it's a different way and a more integrated approach of looking into this. The second thematic area has to do with policies, with institutions, and with the value chain. International trade is going to become much more important in the next few years as compared to the past. As you know, agricultural trade is only a small proportion of agricultural production in most countries. In some products like rice, you only have 6% of the overall production in the world which is being traded. So any significant changes in production has dramatic effects sometimes on international trade. I think all the projections show that trade is going to be more important. So we have to think of markets, of market deficiencies, on how to make this the research to follow to incorporate into our impact pathways, institutions, policies, and markets. And for each product that we develop, also to have in mind that there is a value chain in which countries can operate, which should be a substantial ingredient of our work. We are now working with one single strategy. In the past, as Jean was mentioning, there were 15 centers with 15 strategies. Now we have a single strategy, and the strategy is very simple. We need impact on the ground, and we need impact on the ground on 4 level outcomes, which are poverty reduction, world food security, improvements in world food security, sustainability of natural resource management, and nutrition and health. So all our projects will be measured in relation to these outcomes. And of course, this requires the development of a methodology of metrics, indicators that will be able to look at across the board, the whole program portfolio, and to be able to see which ones are the ones that are likely to have a greater impact. Another issue in which we are paying much greater attention than in the past is the notion of partnerships. Our centers deliver research and they produce international public goods. But in order to reach the farmer, you need to engage with partners. And the partners can be national institutions, they can be universities, they can be civil society, they can be farmers' associations. And therefore, in every single project that we are submitting for the consideration of donors, that impact pathway must clearly identify who are the partners and how the farmers eventually will be able to benefit from the product of the research. And as a result, all these programs were conceived in consultation with different stakeholders in order to make sure that that they are demand more than supply driven, that the research is more demand than supply driven. It's not always easy, and there is room for improvement. But the notion is that that in order to have that impact, the partnerships have to be given a much greater attention, and as a result, some of the partnership work is even being financed within the projects, the programs themselves. Gender, it's a big issue. Everyone speaks about gender, but everyone realizes that women in agriculture could make a big difference. A recent FAO study has shown that if women were given the same access to land, to credit, to technologies, to best practices as men has had in the past, this could increase production by up to 17% in developing countries. And therefore, gender is in all our programs, and I must say, very much at the insistence of the donor community, is mainstream in every single program. And it's different. The gender policies and strategies, although they will have a common components of improving the livelihoods and the role that the women can play in agriculture, but obviously they will vary according to the product. It's not the same the gender in forestry than the gender in aquaculture, or the gender in crop improvement, or on livestock, or and on soil preservation. So these things are being mainstream. And as I mentioned, all the programs are very much oriented to impact on the ground, and therefore there will be an accountability for all these programs through a system of monitoring and evaluation that will take into account this. So it has been a big cultural change for centers, having to move from 40 years of doing business according to their own mandates to now doing business in a more collective fashion towards common goals. And this cultural change is not always easy. It has been difficult. But as Jean was saying, I think that now we have reached a turning point in which the centers are speaking with a single voice. They see that some of the results of this reform is being seen, like expansion of funding and support on new areas for doing research, and this is a good sign. On the other hand, I think that any reform also requires cultural changes on the side of donors, because donors in the past, they were attending their own pet projects with comparison to others, while now we have a more integrated approach, and you have to look at how the funds should be harmonized so as to have an impact on the outcomes that we have identified. Multi-year commitments is an important thing. Research is a multi-year undertaking. Some of the results of research that we are witnessing today are things that their origins, their research origins were done 5 or 10 years ago. So since we have a multi-year undertaking in research, in only not to disrupt it, we need sustainability of financing. And this is something that we certainly are looking as part of the reform. So let me tell you a few success stories. When we talk about the CGIAR, everyone remembers the Green Revolution, which made a difference, without any doubt. It saved lives to millions of people in South and Southeast Asia as a result of high-yielding production varieties in wheat and rice. But that was done in the 70s and early 80s. Since then, and although perhaps without such spectacular results, the CG has continued to face the challenges of today. And in the late 80s, for example, we were able, as a result of CG work, of providing a biological control of a mealy bug pest infecting the cassava crop in Africa that had practically wiped out the crop from important regions in Africa. As a result of this biological control, cassava was back into full production, and it brought benefits of the order of 4 billion a year. But we have some more recent examples that I'd like to bring to your attention, which are probably less known. In 2010, the potato crop in the Andean region of Cusco was totally wiped out as a result of some blight disease that affected the whole crop. And this called for an emergency situation in the whole country. But as a result of work done in CIP, in our Center for Roots and Tubers and Potatoes, which is in Peru, in 2011, 2 new varieties which are resistant to this disease were put on the market. And today, 2011, the crop increased. We are back in production of potatoes, with crops increasing by 3 times the current yield in the past. We have an example which I saw it personally 6 months ago in Bangladesh, which is quite revealing that research can improve the lives of rural poor. I was taken in Bangladesh to the south, in which rice farmers for the last few years had been trying, for the last decades, had been trying to put a rice crop as their only subsistence crop for many years. They had half an acre of land. And in view of the monsoons, the water came, the rice was submerged, and they lost the crop. So they tried again, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and at the end of the year they were lucky if they were having one crop with significant low yields. And these farmers were living on $1.50 a day. As a result of research done by our centers, we have now what we call the scuba rice. And I say scuba because it's rice that withstand being underwater for more than 2 weeks. So the monsoons come, the whole crop is submerged underwater, but after the water goes, after 2 weeks, the rice comes back again. And as a result, some of these farmers who were struggling to get one crop, now they're getting 2, and even in some cases 3 crops. And because of best practices, they are able to combine this scuba rice with fish, and with prawns and shrimps, and with vegetables. And this is an integrated production system that has changed the lives of these people, in the sense that now they have their fish to sell in the market, and also. So at the beginning, we were having big fish, and because of cultural habits in the country, some of these big fish were eaten or sold by the men population, and the women and children were not having the same access to those fish as the men had. So we changed for small fish, and now we have small fish. Everyone gets the same share in consumption habits. But the important thing, and that's where I'm trying to come up, is that because they're small fish, they are fried with skeleton, with the eyes, with everything, and as a result, the children, the nutrition of the children in terms of vitamins, iron, calcium has increased tremendously over the last few years. So there you have a research project which is not rocket science. It's just bringing best practices together with fish and rice, and bringing new varieties which are resistant to certain stresses, and then which have changed their lives, in the sense that these people now are making $6 to $7 a day instead of $1.50. And also the children now, have a much higher levels of nutrition. So that's an example. Another one that I'd like to bring to your attention, in Rwanda, not so long ago, the bush beans that they used to produce for subsistence level, for subsistence consumption, has been replaced by climbing beans. These climbing beans, not only they utilize much less land than the rest, but they can produce harvest and yields 3 and 4 times more than the previous varieties. And as a result, in Rwanda, we have moved on beans from a subsistence agriculture to a cash crop agriculture, and now exports. They're even exporting to their neighbors beans. So it has made a significant change in dealing with food security issues, but at the same time in changing the lives of many of these farmers. And just to round up, we have at present around 50 or 60 new varieties of drought-resistant cereals, maize, rice, sorghum, a number of others, maize I mentioned wheat, sorry. And also there has been a lot of varieties that through research, what we call biofortification, which is a project that has been supported very much by the IDRC. There are a number of varieties now which have higher levels of nutrition, vitamin A rich maize or cassava or sweet potatoes, which are available in the market, and that has made a difference. So maybe they're not as spectacular as the Green Revolution that saved millions of people, but these new research findings that I'm bringing to your attention are there, and they count, and they make a difference. And therefore, I think it's important, and we have brought with us some brochures in which these results are highlighted, and I'd like you to take them with you when you leave. So let me close by saying that I think there is a global recognition at present that international agricultural research is part of the solution to world food security problems. I'm not saying it's the whole solution, but it's certainly part of the solution. And if you look back at the record of the CGIAR, you will find that the CGIAR has a fairly good track record. It has delivered value for money, and it is often cited that for every dollar that you invest in agricultural research in the CGIAR, you get $9 of productivity improvements in developing countries. So it's not a bad record. And World Bank, in a recent study looking at international research in agriculture at large, came up with an average figure saying that the rates of return on agricultural investment are of around 46% in general, and in some cases they go up to 200%. So in times of difficulties, when governments are constrained with budgetary deficits and having to adjust, I think that they will certainly look more carefully at the comparative advantages that they can draw from investing in that area instead of other areas to perceive the same goals, to combat poverty or food security or to improve the efficiency of natural resources to cope with climate change. And I think in that sense, I think that agriculture has proven that it is a very powerful instrument to combat poverty, and that investment in agriculture, as I mentioned, it's value for money. And I certainly hope that this trend of expanding agricultural production, at the moment, in the last few years, we have jumped from $640 million for the whole agricultural production to around $740 million in 2011. And this is not a big deal. When you come to think about it, that it's only $740 million going to international agricultural research in the world today, and in the light of the results that you can achieve, it's clear that this will require, with time, an expansion if we want to be able to meet the challenges that I just presented to you. And therefore, we very much look forward that we can travel this journey towards successful outcomes together in here. Since I am in Canada and I know it's a custom, je voudrais terminer.
So I'm in Canada, so I'd like to finish in French now. I'd like to thank our hosts today, Jean Lebel, for having organised my talk here today. It's very important for us. It's not only important to visit the centres to see what they're doing, but also to visit the organisations that sponsor us, that allow us, that enable us to do the work we do. So for me, it's a real pleasure to be in Canada, because right from the outset, Canada has been one of our most loyal partners, and has shown us through your professionalism and through your commitment, you've shown us that very positive results can be obtained. So I'd like to thank the IDRC. I'll be talking to CETA this afternoon. Both of you have been fantastic partners, and I know that I can count on you to continue in tackling food security, and we share this as a common goal. Thank you very much.
Alors, merci beaucoup.
So thank you very much, Carlos.
That brought to our attention, I think, the challenge, but also numbers of examples of success. We're going to go to the question period, but before we do so, because I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves briefly at the microphone. If you have any question, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jean Lebel. I'm a Director of Agriculture and Environment here at IDRC. So I forgot to do this as a courtesy at the beginning. I'm trying to catch up over here. Thank you. If you have a question, so please come at the microphone. State your name, your organization, as well as be brief. We have many people over here. If you are on the webcast, you can send your question in also, and I will ask you the same thing. Please be brief with your question. One line is sufficient for me to read over here and Carlos to read, as well as identifying yourself. Thank you very much. So we have 3 on this side, 2 on that side, and I think I'm going to start with David Walsh. David, you want to introduce yourself?
Oui, c'est ça. Merci. My name is David Welsh. I'm at the School of Social Work, University d'Ottawa, with an interest on food security and Aboriginal issues particularly. I found it really interesting. I have 2 questions sort of linked together. One is, you've mentioned the Green Revolution. It saved millions of lives, and people, I think we have to acknowledge that. But we know now there's the perverse effects of the Green Revolution of water tables, pesticide use, and so on and so forth, which leads people now to question that. And I think you were indirectly questioning that whole thinking. Not that it was bad thinking. It was just... It was a type of thinking that maybe worked at one point and is no longer appropriate. So in terms of the new things that you're mentioning, because it's always a question of, are we going to start seeing 10 years down the road, 15 years, once again, these same perverse effects in terms of we saw with the Green Revolution. And especially now because of the pressure, as you know, with the Gates Green Revolution, for want of a better name, what's happening in Africa. And then the other thing linked to that is we say there's a lack of good land, but we keep hearing about and reading about what we call the land grab. That is corporations and countries grabbing millions of acres in Africa, which presumably is fertile land, otherwise they wouldn't bother, and grabbing it for their own uses when we say there's not enough fertile land. So what's the story? Is it there's enough fertile land for capital development for other countries to feed them, or the private sector, and not enough for the local people? In other words, why isn't that land being developed for the interests of the local people, say, in Africa?
Thank you. We already have 3 sub-questions in the question of David. And we'll take a few questions, Carlos, and move to you afterwards. Sir?
Gunter Rojo from Capra International. We're doing international development work, also evaluation, in a wide array. But my question goes back to my experience in Bolivia in the 1960s. We had a remarkable food security story that caught world headlines, and that was the introduction of the trout into Lake Titicaca. It promised a rosy future, and indeed the trout were so popular, they had no enemies, they grew to enormous sizes, but the bonanza has disappeared, mostly because of overfishing and the lack of understanding of the people for whose benefit this was introduced. And I'm wondering whether you could add a comment or 2 to your remarkable list of success stories, how the scientific advances that were developed in various areas were actually given greater sustainability in the future through some form of effective training of the people who would actually use these resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll go for one last question in this round.
Thank you for what I thought was a very interesting presentation. My question is...
Matthew, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure, sorry. Matthew Straub with the Haiti program at CETA. My question relates to the expanded role of the CGIAR in terms of, you said CGIAR traditionally provided the tool, i.e. research, and is expanding its role in terms of going more towards the vehicle, those being partnerships. And I'm wondering whether you could indulge us a bit on how the CGIAR is undertaking actually doing the handoff of research to its partners, something I think has proven to be quite a challenge between research centers and the development community, and how you're disseminating knowledge and getting that knowledge to the ground.
Thank you, Matthew. And while you prepare yourself for the answer, I'd like to remind the audience you can use French also for your question, as Carlos is perfectly bilingual, and we have also interpretation service that is provided with us. So, Carlos, you want to answer those 3 points?
Thank you very much. Yes, definitely, research can bring benefits, but also with time it can bring costs, and you were referring to the Green Revolution, in which there is a lot of literature today that brings out some of these perverse. Remember, the Green Revolution was not only the product of crop improvements, higher yields, but it came up together with much greater use of irrigation and of fertilizers at the same time. It wasn't. But the notion of research and of the yielding was certainly at the time an extremely necessary contribution in order to be able to stop the famine and the malnutrition that prevailed at the time. So I think it was necessary. And then probably the spillover effects were never measured, because what we had to face was a political and an ethical situation that had to be confronted. So how are we going? The question was, how are we going to do in order to make sure that these perverse effects will not occur again in the future with our new types of research? Well, it's a difficult question. I think that definitely there is a much greater conscience than at the time of the notion of sustainability and of incorporating into any research on that is geared to genetic improvement of crops, to incorporate the notion of sustainability. And I think that this, in a sense, will take care of some of the perverse effects that we saw in the Green Revolution. I'm not saying that other effects that we haven't foreseen may not crop up in the future, but certainly the awareness, the degrees of information are much greater than at the time. On the notion of land grabs, definitely. I mean, there are examples that this is happening. Not only in Africa, this Asia, even in Latin America, it is happening. And what can you do about it is a big question, I imagine. And this is certainly a question that goes far beyond the CGIAR. What I think, the thinking that is coming out of discussions on the subject, which are numerous at the moment, is that there should be a much greater engagement of the people who live in the land in the decision-making process before these land grabs or investments, as some other people would like to call it, take place. And that and this is very much lacking at the moment in many places. So people are faced with situations when things have already gone the extra mile. And yes, it's a phenomenon that we have to look into it. Definitely not. It's not the competence of the CGIAR, but we are certainly witnessing that's happening in different parts of the world. So I don't have an answer on this, but this is certainly an issue that I can think can only be tackled by at the national level by a greater participation of everyone involved in the decision-making process, which is not happening at the time. On the question of Bolivia, your question and the overfishing and how scientific advances are going to prevent this to happen as well in the future. I think that the answer here is very much linked with the notion of partnerships that I mentioned. The CGIAR delivers research outputs, which are in general international public goods, and which is probably new varieties. In aquaculture, there has been tremendous improvements in the production of some of the local fish by science-based inputs. But the best practices, so as to how to maintain these levels of production, will have to come through closer associations with between the research, those conducting research, and those doing the extension and the development work, and by capacity building. And in all our programs, the same way that we have a gender mainstreaming, there is also a capacity building component, which hasn't been tested in particular cases in some of these new projects, but which is very much present. And I think that that notion will have to be dealt with through an impact pathway which comes at the downstream more than the upstream level of research. Matthew, well, as I mentioned before, some of the new programs are being conceived in close consultation and partnership with other researchers. So a number of institutions, national or regional, are part of our programs, and they not only contribute as partners, as research partners in the undertaking, but they have also been now incorporated into the management structures of the programs. It is not only that they participate with their scientific input, but in the management structures of the programs, there is not only place for the centers who do the research, but for partners who contribute significantly to the achievement of the goals. So there will be a possibility of these researchers, of these other institutions, to have a great degree of ownership of whatever comes out as an outcome to these programs. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way we are dealing with this.
Thank you, and we're going to go through 3 other questions now, but I will just stand up and pull back the podium over here because you cannot see this end of the audience. So, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to Dr. Castillo for this informative and in-depth presentation on this issue. No doubt on the importance of extreme, in fact, importance of the applied research on agriculture related to the production and productivity. And I have 3 quick points. First, the concern is related to effectiveness. What is the effectiveness? I mean the real impact on the ground of these researches of the consortium, these 15 centers. This is what matters. I hear some success stories, but I am talking relatively. what is exactly the effectiveness. Secondly, I think there is some sort of concentration on the applied research centers on agriculture and this food security, on the genetically modified plants and products. And I think you agree with me, this is controversial, especially in our countries, because they just are, most of the people or many of them are skeptical of these genetically modified products. And this is a field of concentration on your researches. So I wonder if you have, what do you think about this? And if there is other alternative which are going to meet the aspirations of the people in the developing countries. The third and last point related to how you as centers engage with the local communities, because I think it is very important. I mean, how do you instill the spirit of innovation in the local communities, the farmers and the cattle raisers and this? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So
I forgot I am Musa Muhammad, Ambassador of Sudan in Ottawa.
Thank you, Ambassador. So our first question in each round have 3 sub-questions now. Etienne.
Bonjour, merci pour cet exposé.
Thank you for your presentation, Carlos. I'm here, a visiting professor at University of Ottawa. A question on the impact now. We all know that we have an intervention of funders to justify, before we start a research project, the impact that we will have, and to justify afterwards the impact it had. So as scientists, we know that it is very difficult to relate a scientific cause to give it a link or a causality, because sometimes the results can be 15, 20 years away. Some impacts may be a complex combination between social innovation, technological innovation, and my question, therefore, is, I know that your group worked on this closely, but is the risk of translating these difficult questions in marketing of the research by simple slogans? Is there a risk? Do you have any protection measures? Do you have a plan to try and educate the funders to the complexity of innovation pathways in the South? Yes.
I'm from the United Nations World Food Program, and I suppose my question comes from an organizational background where we are so concerned and focused on the world's most poor and food insecure. And what struck me about your presentation is those massive challenges you talked about at the beginning, you know, a population of 9 billion by 2050, climate change. They just go on one after the next. Do we need another revolution like we had in the 70s and 80s if we are going to be able to meet that by 2050? Do you think that the current research agenda is sufficient in order to meet those challenges? And if not, what might be the consequences of that?
Thank you very much. So, Cal.
Merci. So, Mr. Ambassador, your first question was the effectiveness concept and the measure and the impact on the ground. I think a number of questions came around impact on the ground, and maybe I will address them together. It's a difficult question. I've taken your question from CIRAD. Impact on the ground is a long-term objective, and I think that we will be measured at the end of the day for having made a difference on the livelihoods of the poor in terms of poverty, in terms of food security, in terms of management of resources, and in terms of nutrition and health. And there is no doubt that this is the objective. How to get there is a much more difficult issue. We in the research, what we can produce is research outputs and then research outcomes. And the impact will depend very much on a number of other factors, like the ones I mentioned, partnerships, institutions, policies, that will be part of the impact pathway, but that will have a longer period of time to develop. So at the moment, I think that we are very much concentrating towards outcomes that would make progress towards that impact in the future. Let's take an example. The research output would be the development of new varieties that may be resistant to pests and diseases, or may be tolerant to drought or salinity or floods, as I mentioned. The research outcome will be how many farmers are going to be able to have access to this research and put them and make use of them. And that's an outcome. And then the impact would be, as a result of this higher utilization of these new varieties, how has this affected farmers in terms of income, in terms of employment, in terms of nutrition, and this is a longer way to go. How are we tackling this issue? Is by, at the moment, working together with donors on templates for monitoring and evaluation that will ensure that the indicators are there from the beginning, so that we can measure the path towards that impact that will come at a certain time. And there are methodological issues that we have to face. Some of these issues are not easy. It's much easier to measure yield improvements than to measure efficiencies that we can gain through better use of water or land, or through a more efficient utilization of inputs. So I think I get the message that perhaps the impact is something that everyone wants. The donors want to say, "Well, I put the money here, and I managed to have 50 million people out of poverty." And sometimes I must confess that since I've been in this job for the last 2 years, I found some of these figures, a bit ambitious in my view of seeing. And I would prefer them to concentrate on outcomes and see how the research is. Frankly, are the farmers taking the products? Are they using them? Do they find them that they respond to their demands, which are outcomes, much more than to be thinking in terms of impacts in 3 years, which is going to be very, very difficult to attain. But the overall goal is there. At the end of the day, if we do not manage to get people out of poverty or to improve their food security standards, I think that we have failed. Your second question, Ambassador, was with genetically modified plants, which is a controversial issue. I know it. I think research should be open to every possible mechanism. Our objective is to have an impact on the poor and the poor farmers, and to improve their livelihoods. And therefore, I think that as researchers, we should not be shy by ideological discussions or on the scientific merits of a certain mechanism. There is little research that is being undertaken today in the centers on genetically modified. I would say, I don't have the exact figure because I don't think, but around 5%. Yeah. Around 5%, no more than 5%. That doesn't mean that in the future, as a result of this research, we may well find out that something that will take 10 years through conventional breeding to produce a variety which is resistant to a certain disease or something, you can have the same result in lesser years with some genetically modified. I don't know it. But in any case, it would be up to the farmers, to the governments of the countries to decide the way they want to go. We are not imposing by no means any type of thing. The only thing we can do is to put on the table, these are the available mechanisms to reach a certain outcome, and it is up to the governments to use it or not. But I think it would be a mistake to shy away from exploring scientific ways in which you can have an impact. So how do the centers engage with local communities? Well, as I mentioned, perhaps one of the differences between these new sets of programs than the ones in the past is that these are programs that are conceived from the beginning in direct consultation with NARS, with the national institutions, with civil society, with farmers' cooperation. Perhaps not as much as we would have liked to. Maybe some of these communities may not be duly represented, but the notion is to come up with programs that not only look at the research that we are going to envisage, but also to look at the partners we're going to engage with in order to have that impact on the ground and to reach the communities. At the end of the day, this is the aim of all the research, and therefore, as I mentioned, in the development of the projects, the notion of participation is very much there. And responding to a previous question, some of these partners are part of the management structures of the organization, and they're part of the decision making, and therefore they will have a say as the progress goes along. On the impact, well, yes, I'll come back again. I think I gave part of the answer. I already gave it, but yes, it is true. Some of the research results are going to be negative. Not necessarily everything that we are undertaking is going to produce positive results. Some of the results, even if they are very positive, they may be upset in the impact pathway towards benefits by factors that are totally external to the research, and it will be very difficult to measure whether, if finally we have an impact, it is only because of the research or because some other factors also help in that direction. So I think on impact I stop there. And then on World Food Programme, Philip, do we need another green revolution for 2050 in order to meet the challenges? Personally, I think not. I think that it is doable. I think that we will be able to increase production by 70% or more with the technologies that are available today, and that will certainly come through a series of different ways of tackling this research: genetic improvement, molecular breeding, better quality of food rather than quantity, focus on the better quality through biofortification. This is one of our projects. By diversification of the production systems that we have today, I think that we have been many times very focused on one commodity and not on the benefits of bringing crops, livestock, trees, and into a production system. More effective management of land and water. Much greater attention to policies, institutions, value chains, markets. So I think it's doable. The question is not so much is it, if you will be able to reach that goal. The question is the access. Once you have the quantity, it is not only a matter of quantity. It is a question of how do you get to the people who need it most, and that's another question, and that's a much more difficult question, and therefore this is what we have to be thinking in terms: quality, quantity, but at the same time accessibility, and the accessibility. Well, there are a number of things that we look into these research programs, and we hope to be able to round the circle in this respect.
Yeah, and if I may add my perspective over here, it's not one green revolution, but what Carlos was alluding toward is multiple green revolution that comes from very different angle, that comes from very different activities, not only the production that I think can fix the problem, and that's a line that has been used in the recent past. Multiple small revolution will lead to the outcome. I'm responsible for checking on time over here. and I know that we have a commitment with a radio interview afterwards, so we're going to take 4 very short questions, and I may interrupt you if your question is tall, and we're going to take 4 very short answers, Carlos, also from you, and we will then walk out of this room. We're pressed a little bit by time. Sir, you have less than 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Loam Constantine. I'm a lecturer at Great Lakes University in Kenya. I'm a postdoc here at University of Ottawa. My concern is about sugar production. Recently, in East Africa, for instance, the cost of sugar was so much, and then it nearly caused a lot of problem for us. That meant there's so much need for production of sugar. But what I'm asking is, what is the future of sugar production when the farmers are not exactly gaining so much from there?
Thank you very much.
And then one last thing is that...
No, I'm stopping you here. Thank you. We're going to give the microphone to the lady behind you. I'm sorry, we have to manage time. Elizabeth McAllister, who was leading the review, the external review of the CGIAR in 2007. Elizabeth.
Frustrating to have 30 seconds. Just to pick up on a point Carlos made on impact of the CG has to be taken up by donors, by the World Food Program, by the government of Sudan and others. You cannot expect a $760 million research system to produce results at the level of the farmers. And it was exactly that incentive created by the donors when they switched from 64% core funding to 32% core funding, increasing the number of projects that went up by 100, 200, 300 projects per center. That meant scientists who should have been at the bench were out in the field being extension workers. This is not what we need of the CG. The CG is the science center. Our main recommendation was that there had to be a ceding of sovereignty from the centers to the consortium, but of the donors to the fund. So there would be core financing and a joint strategy where the donors took on their responsibility to find out what the research was and to apply that research and to ensure that research that worked was scaled up. So I think we have to be very careful in expecting every institution to have final outcomes on the ground. A successful outcome for the CG is that their partners who are funding and supporting this institution are taking up the research and doing what they need to do.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a comment. You're lucky there's no question. Very rapidly, because I had a question from Elizabeth before, and they
Sarah
might be tough.
Cambitos from the United Nations Association in Canada, a civil society organization. It was really encouraging to see that gender is part of your research. I am missing the youth, especially in Africa. It's a crisis we are facing. Young people think that farming and gardening, all of those things are really drudgery and we should run away from it. What research component could you really say to cultivate a generation of young researchers?
Thank you very much. And the final, 30 seconds.
Bonjour, Nathalie McSweeney.
Nathalie McSweeney. I'm a PhD student at the University of Quebec in Outaouais. Very quickly, your presentation was very interesting. There's been a lot of talk about new crops, the way we can feed the world using these new crops, but you didn't spend much time talking about the role of trade, agricultural trade, the impact on food security. This seems to be a central part of the discussions that we should have. And also, you didn't talk much about production practices that can ensure food security. I'd like to hear what you have to say on the role of all these aspects.
Sugar and then the role of youth.
On sugar, I wish I had the crystal ball with me on the prices of sugar for the future. According to FAO projections and the OECD projections, sugar prices are going to remain high. Perhaps not as high as some of the prices that we have seen in the last few years, but above the average of the trend of the last 10 years. So we will have to cope with prices, and it depends on the side that you're looking at price hikes. That if you're looking at it from a consumer or a producer, that you may have different effects on it. For a producer, it may be a good sign that they can increase production and to meet the requirements, and as a result, prices will decline. For a consumer, you have to, if you are faced with high sugar prices, then you will have to, governments and at the national level, they should come up with some kind of safety net in order to be able for these consumers to not to suffer unduly the consequences of the price hikes. But as to the future, I think we will have to live with commodity prices at higher levels that we had a few decades ago, and this is something that may have beneficial effects as well as negative effects, depending on which side of the band you're in. Elizabeth, yeah, I fully agree with the comment. It was a comment, so I don't have to say it. Young people is missing. That's true, and scientists are also not. We have to make sure with this research that we are able to attract young people back into farming and back into science, and to have younger researchers to join our research institutes. And for this, I think that we have a great advocacy role to play, and I feel that the success stories that we produce are going to breed greater successes, and to bring people that were discouraged by agriculture because they didn't find employment, because their incomes were low, because they couldn't move into the market because of efficiencies, they couldn't move the value chain. I think that all these aspects are contemplated in the programs, and hopefully by producing results we will be able to attract people who were discouraged by it. It's not a you will not do it overnight, but I think the capacity, the bringing new scientists into this program is very much in our mind. On the role of trade, very briefly. On the role of trade, what can I say? Trade, as I mentioned, is going to increase. World food security is going to become a major issue or a key issue in international trade negotiations. It has not been until now. How to deal with them? There are different ways of dealing with these issues in trade negotiations. One of them would be perhaps to give the concept of access to supplies a new notion in negotiations. As we have access to markets, we have never had in the negotiations this access to supplies. This could be one of the things. Another issue would be export restrictions and how to deal with them so that they will not have unnecessary detrimental effects on price hikes and on consumers. And finally, there are a number of supply management issues that I could deal with, but I don't have time to express at this moment. But definitely, world food security is in the agenda now of trade.
Thank you very much, Carlos. If you have any more questions, we have with us Daniela Alfaro from the consortium office, and Daniela can provide you. Please guide your question to Daniela, because Carlos needs really to exit this place rapidly, otherwise I'm gonna my head cut by our communication people. So I want to thank the audiovisual people. I want to thank our interpretation service people. I want to thank the conference service of IDRC, as well as the work done by our communication group. And above all, I want to thank you here and in the web sphere for your question, your quality of interaction with our guests, and ultimately, Carlos, I really want to thank you for the time you took to talk to us this morning, to bring us to speed. Where's the CGIAR? Bring also some of the best and of the challenge that are ahead of us. It was a pleasure to have you as a guest at IDRC, and we hope that we're going to see you again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.